Thank you so much for joining. It's nice to see the attendance picking up a bit more after people were on leave over the school holidays. Yeah, looking forward to today's session. So yeah, if you had a look at the meetup description, you'll know that this topic is about MVNOs. Some of you might not be familiar with our customer lifecycle story, but yeah, we're going to be looking specifically at how behavioral intelligence plays a role with how MVNOs engage with customers as they move from unknowns to long-term customers. But we're not going to jump straight into that. I'm going to be giving a bit more of a backstory about what MVNOs are, and then get into the life cycle stuff a bit later. So if any of you have questions as we go, please pop them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand. So yeah, let's just hop straight in. So the first thing we're going to unpack is kind of the basics. What is an MVNO? So MVNO is a mobile virtual network operator, and it's a mobile service provider that basically sells cellular plans directly to consumers, but it doesn't own the physical cell towers or the network infrastructure that it uses. So instead of owning that, they buy the network access in bulk from traditional mobile network operators, or MNOs. So in South Africa, that would be like Vodacom or Telkom, and then they rebrand it as their own. So that's an MVNO. Just to understand it a bit better, it's useful to look at kind of the differences between the MVNO and an MNO. So the primary difference is about kind of like where each of them capture value and what they own. So the infrastructure section, so this is about who owns the physical stuff. So the cell towers, the spectrum, the cables, the radio equipment. So an MNO will build and own their own network and their infrastructure. And then an MVNO doesn't own the physical hardware or the licensed spectrum. They strike a deal to lease capacity from an MNO, and then they resell it under their own brand. So you can think of it like the difference between like owning an apartment building versus renting specific units in someone else's building. Then on pricing, so pricing is purely about like cost structure. So MNOs have to fund all their infrastructure, so it's a lot more expensive. There's a lot more overhead to get started, whereas MVNOs kind of skip the capital costs entirely, and then they undercut MNOs on price, which makes them more competitive. And this is kind of what's differentiated them in the past, is that they can compete quite aggressively on price, but that is starting to bite some MVNOs in the butt. Then on network priority, so MVNOs kind of function on shared infrastructure, because an MNO doesn't just lease capacity to one MVNO. There's going to be several MVNOs on the same infrastructure. And because the MNO owns the network, its own direct subscribers are going to get first access. So MNOs also sell direct to customer. They don't just resell to MVNOs, they also sell direct to customer. So when their customers, when traffic is high, their customers get priority and MVNOs get kind of second priority. Then on plan focus, so that's about who the plans are actually built for. So MNOs tend to play it broad, and they develop standard postpaid or prepaid contracts, and then often kind of bundle new phone and financing and lock in kind of a wide customer base. But MVNOs intentionally go narrow because they have the ability to kind of focus on branding and cheaper pricing or customized pricing. They can carve out a niche and then target that. So now we're going to look at some emerging trends in the MVNO market at the moment and kind of how they're positioned today. So the first trend is that the market is growing, but so is competition. So the global mobile virtual network operator market size was valued at $98.74 billion in 2025, and it's projected to grow to $107.02 billion in 2026. And just to kind of wrap your head around it, in the August of 2025, there were approximately 2.4 MVNOs for every MNO worldwide. So we're looking at big concentration of MVNOs or saturation of the MVNO market. And in some markets, that's seen some market consolidation. So MVNOs are starting to get absorbed by MNOs because they're just failing. So MNOs will buy them out. And yeah, another interesting trend is that light MVNOs, we'll unpack that a bit later, are outpacing MVNOs. So a light MVNO is kind of like a mini MVNO, except they have even less control over their infrastructure. So a light MVNO outsources everything and only focuses on their brand affinity and their fintech bundling or their real retail kind of loyalty promotions. And we're seeing a huge shift of the market share towards light MVNOs. And we're going to unpack a little bit more about why that is and what we can learn from it a bit later. Connectivity is a commodity at the moment. So customers don't buy from an MVNO because they want mobile data. They know that they can get that from anyone. So they're not buying connectivity, and price differentiation has also been kind of proven as a weak way to acquire customers and keep them. So what MVNOs have now recognized as something that they can differentiate on is tying their products in with an ecosystem of other digital products. So that kind of marks the rise of something that's called an embedded MVNO. And you can see this in retail brands and fintech and in banks, for example, where they are embedding mobile services in their existing offerings. And they're not necessarily telecom operators, but they resell access bundled up with other things. And this is working pretty well. So if we look at a quick comparison between light MVNOs and full MVNOs, light MVNOs being the embedded MVNOs that I was mentioning. So they basically have, for full MVNO, they control pretty much everything to do with their network, not necessarily the hardware, like the infrastructure, but their network. So they don't necessarily own radio access infrastructure, but they own their core network hardware. So that is basically the brain of the cellular network. So while the cell towers kind of handle the physical wireless connection to your phone, the core network manages everything that happens after that. So that's like routing and price bundling. So it gives MVNOs a lot more, full MVNOs a lot more control over the products that they're offering to customers, but it also means that they have more overhead. Light MVNOs, on the other hand, they lease both the network infrastructure and the core from host operators. So they focus primarily on branding and marketing. So yeah, light MVNOs are growing much faster than full MVNOs, primarily because they require significantly less upfront capital, and they have a much faster time to market, and they allow non-telecom brands to easily bundle their mobile plans into their existing ecosystems. So it's a similar difference between MNOs and MVNOs. So MVNOs didn't want the heavy investment and capital required to like own the radio access, so they leased it. And light MVNOs don't want the responsibility of operating their own core network infrastructure, so they leased it. So essentially, they're moving the place where they capture value from customers further up the stack and closer to where you're actually dealing with the customer, not just the background stuff. So why are light MVNOs finding it easier to grow and capture value? So as I mentioned, light MVNOs are outperforming full MVNOs because their model requires significantly lower upfront investment and offers faster market deployment. So for example, a bank MVNO, these are kind of rising as like significant players in the market at the moment. So it's MVNOs like Capita Connect, or in your bank, you'll see most banks are doing this now, that you can buy airtime or data. And the bank kind of handles all the customer facing elements. So this includes the branding, the SIM distribution, the marketing, pricing plans, billing, all of that is in the bank's mobile app. And banks like Capita Connect are growing significantly because of this. So they use the MVNO service to anchor customers in the ecosystem, in the existing banking ecosystem. And then they tie it to loyalty programs and rewards. And they already have all the trust and the data that's associated with building customer loyalty. And kind of by virtue of exploiting their existing customer base, they've solved the customer acquisition and retention problem. So the question then is like, how can other MVNOs that aren't bank MVNOs or embedded MVNOs replicate this effect? So how do you engage with customers as if you know them already? How do you offer them value that benefits them so clearly that you become the only viable option for them? And this comes back to something that we've been talking about for a long time, and that's behavioral personalization, behavioral strategies. And we've developed a framework for MVNOs and other enterprises. This is kind of something that can translate into different industries, that maps how behavioral intelligence needs to adapt throughout the customer life cycle, so that you're not just throwing a blanket behavioral strategy at customers, no matter where they are in the stage, but you're tailoring it to what they need at different stages of familiarity with your product or offering. So here's an overview of the customer life cycle if you're not familiar with it. So you can see at the top there, discovery and onboarding, and activation and maintaining. So the first two columns are when you don't know much about your customer. They haven't purchased anything yet, so you don't have any interaction data with them. On the right-hand side, the activation and maintenance side, that's when you have a customer who's bought something and there's an ongoing interaction with them. So you have data coming in that you can make predictions from. So the first stage, the discovery stage, is the process of getting a distinct, differentiated value proposition in front of a defined niche before the customer defaults to the host MNO or an incumbent competitor with a stronger retail footprint. So this is about reaching out to a market that you don't know anything about, but making sure that you're getting the right message to the right people with the highest probability of having them convert. So some of the strategies that MVNOs might use here is like digital contact. So that's getting to the digital channels where their desired audience is. Lead generation, so trying to figure out who their market is and who the best prospects are. And then awareness, just like a billboard is awareness, it's placing messages about your offering in places where people are most likely to notice it. Then the engage stage, this is about converting a lead into a fully verified SIM or eSIM holder with minimal drop-off. So, and then you're also capturing enough early behavioral signals to build a propensity model before there's actually transaction history. So this is when you're making cold outreach and you're getting people through your digital onboarding process, and you're also building up sales propensity scores. So who's most likely to buy? That can then inform your engagement strategies. Then activation is about getting someone from being a dormant SIM or unactivated SIM into a spending customer and kind of building habitual behavior so that they continue spending with you. This is the single biggest revenue leakage point for MVNOs, because SIMs that don't top up are just cost. They don't make up what you've spent on them through the acquisition phase, so it's just a loss. So in this stage, you're doing nudge to use strategies, you're cross-selling to make sure that you're putting alternative options in front of the customers, and you're also detecting fraud, because this is when fraud is most likely to happen. Then into the final stage, retain. So this is when you're kind of defending your margin and you're making sure that customers that you've gotten through all these stages are staying. And you want to make sure that you have your value proposition that may have worked in the beginning, but you want to make sure that you are continuously repositioning yourself so that you continue to be relevant to individual customers. So here you're upselling, you're cross-selling, and you're intervening at points of churn. So you're detecting when behavior changes and doing something about it. So then if we look at each stage in terms of pain points, so for the discovery stage, in terms of undifferentiated niche marketing, so we know that MVNOs target niches, because they want to differentiate themselves. But often what happens is that they'll target a niche, but then engage generically to that whole niche and not have an efficient way to segment people in that niche. And they're not able to target individuals within it. So it's still generic, even if it's niche. Then customer acquisition costs is kind of notoriously high relative to average revenue per user. So that's especially in prepaid heavy markets, and in highly competitive prepaid markets, the operators frequently spend millions on marketing kind of to chase market share, but these figures mostly reflect churn replacements rather than new net additive users. So they're kind of just making up for what they've lost and not growing their customer base. Then attribution is weak, and what I mean by that is that you might have several digital channels that you've deployed your activation strategies on, but you can't tell where the signups are coming from and why people are signing up. So you don't have a useful way to measure what is actually working and what isn't. Then in the engage stage, so this is when you're kind of trying to get people through to that first action, you're trying to get more information from them. This often is quite riddled with friction. So it's quite difficult for customers to get to that stage. They're having to go through all these verification processes. And this is especially relevant in African markets because they have quite strict SIM registration processes. So you see quite a high drop off of customers there. And then there's the cold start problem. So you don't have any transaction history and you're trying to get people to sign up to your service. So if you don't have any sales propensity scores, you don't know what individual customers want, it's still guesswork, and you're using population level kind of MNO data that you've borrowed from your host provider. Then there's activation, and this is typically when SIM dormancy is quite rampant, and it's quite an underreported MVNO problem. So it happens when customers register, but they don't ever top up and they don't get in the habit of actually using that SIM card. And yeah, so margin pressure, this is when MVNOs, they sell, so they're buying access from the MNO and they're selling at wholesale rates, regardless of whether the customer spends. So a dormant SIM is a guaranteed loss if they don't spend. And yeah, that's a problem for the margin. Then there's real-time responsiveness. So, MVNOs might have all the right strategies, but if they don't have the technology to intervene in real time, those strategies become redundant and the moment is past. And then in retention, this is the final one. So there's a huge amount of churn in MVNOs, and this is because many MVNOs fall into the price competition trap, especially in countries like Kenya and Nigeria. Up to 85 to 87% of mobile users operate dual or multi-SIM phones. So they're switching between which SIM has the best deal at a given point in time. And this does not show any degree of loyalty, and it means you're easily thrown to the side if a better option comes up. Yeah, so moving on, I see that there are some questions. Yes.
From Igor, please go ahead and ask your question, or feel free to drop it in the chat, whichever is easiest for you.
And feel free to ask.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I'm interested how we can manage to make a customer experience. What are the best tools, and how can we use artificial intelligence to make it easier, and to make a design thinking approach for customer experience? So what is your opinion on this?
So we are actually going to get into that now. We're going to talk about how our solutions kind of fit into this whole story. Yeah, so we will get into that just now. Joanna, I see there's another question. Maybe we can get to that as well, and then we can jump into the rest.
I have made Joanna a contributor, so she should be able to ask a question.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you like re-explain the part of activation? I didn't quite understand that one.
Activation, sure.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. So activation, so this is when, so in the engage stage, yes, okay, let's just play it back. So discovery, you don't know the customer yet. You don't have any knowledge of who they are. You only have maybe a place that you want to send messages to. Okay.
Oh,
Then in engage, you want to get those people to engage with you. So sign up, respond to a message, get them moving, basically. And then activation is first spend. So when they actually use their SIM card, they're buying data, they're buying airtime. And then retain is an ongoing relationship, getting them to continuously spend with you.
okay. Oh, now I understand. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool.
Very helpful.
Okay, great. Cool. So just to, hopefully, Igor, this answers your question. So if we think about discovery, you're reaching out to a place that you do not know, customers that you do not know. So in behavioral science, what we do is we split up approaches into the individual, collective, and societal view. So the societal view is kind of the broadest view of a given society. So where are you reaching out to? Kind of what is the geographic location? And then depending on what data you have access to there, you can make some kind of broad assumptions about what people's preferences might be, the language you might use. So you're using a very broad outlook and you send the message out. And then once people start engaging, you want to start learning from them as quickly as possible. So you need models that can adjust that have a high rate of learning. So when a customer finally does take up an offer, you want to have your model instantly learn and also experiment. So one solution to unpack here is dynamic experimentation. So what dynamic experimentation does is that you have several different message options, say A, B, C, D, E, F options. You send them all out to a massive population, and then you see what works best. And then once you've found a few winners, you start exploiting those, but then you introduce some novel options to make sure that you're not missing out on options that could be successful. Then in the smart engage stage, which is what we call it, you're still looking at people from the societal approach because you don't have much interaction data with them. Some of the solutions that we have here is dynamic messaging and then conversational journeys. So dynamic messaging is when you are sending a message out to someone and you're using dynamic experimentation in the background. You have it written in a certain way, making a certain offer. And then as soon as the customer interacts, you're detecting their intent, you're detecting whether it was a positive response or a negative response, and then you're adjusting your learnings and adjusting the next message that you send. Similar in conversational journeys, except this is an agentic journey that you can set up in our workbench on our platform. So this is kind of where you will weave together a customer journey where you're guiding them towards an action. And along the way, you're detecting intent with behavioral algorithms and routing them to different parts of the conversation depending on that intent. And that's meant to reduce friction as far as possible to actually get them to build up interaction data with you and eventually get them to spend in the activation stage. Great. So then once we've gotten our customers signed up, you're in the activation stage and you move from the societal approach into the collective or the individual approach. So a collective is a smaller group of people than society. So I live in South Africa, so society would probably Cape Town. Like, what do people in Cape Town care about? Collective approach is looking at, okay, what's my collective? I am a white middle-class female in South Africa. What does a white middle-class female care about? And obviously, we're not just caring about demographics, and that's why we implement the behavioral algorithms after this. But the collective approach, it forms a good hypothesis about what people might care about with certain characteristics. We obviously don't just look at demographics, we look at behavioral characteristics as well. So we look at, okay, we know that Nicola is white, female, middle class, but also she doesn't respond to messages that are alarmist or that are saying, don't miss out on this offer, but she looks very similar to groups of people in terms of her behavioral signals that respond well to messages that say, you can save on this offer. So then you start offering her more of what that group responds well to. And so what works well here is solutions like the next best action recommender. So you're getting people to, they might be performing an action, buying data, whatever, and then a recommendation comes up that relates well to that, but also to their specific tastes. And as they purchase more, you're learning more from their behavior. And then in the retain stage, this is very much an individual approach because now you have enough behavioral data to understand how this individual responds to certain offers or certain language. And you know how to start building habits and engaging with them at the right time, you know, when they have the best propensity to buy something. So this is all kind of what gets unpacked in our interaction personality solution. So our personality solutions, we have a few of them, which you can check out on our website, but they take behavioral data of a certain customer, they score it against personality archetypes to understand kind of which personality that person is. So are they an intentional personality? Are they an experiential personality? And we'll get to your question just now, Joanna. I'll just finish this point. So this is the personality modules only really work when you have a history of behavioral data of a person. And this kind of informs all the approaches that you take with that person. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's the gist of it. You don't want to just, I mean, we have been preaching the behavioral personalization story for a long time, but like tailoring it to the customer lifecycle is especially important for MVNOs because they have very specific challenges at each stage of the customer lifecycle, and you need a very specific approach to each one. It would take me way too long to go into the details of every single solution that we have, but each of them attempt to solve a specific problem, whether you're trying to decrease uncertainty and learn as much as you can about a specific customer, like in the discovery stage, where the focus is learning, or whether you're trying to kind of evolve a relationship in the retain stage and you're trying to get your customer to feel like you know what they need and yeah, you've established a way of engaging with them as individuals, not necessarily as broad or generic individuals within a society that you don't understand properly.
But yeah, this gave a really good overview of MVNOs, and yeah, I think the customer life cycle is something we always talk about, and it's nice to see the solution across the life cycle, but also understand how it can fit specifically within these verticals.
Cool. If anyone has any other questions, now would be your time. We still have a bit of time. Okay. Okay.
Igor, you still got your hand up?
Yes, just want to clarify if it's possible to share the presentation, as I was not from the beginning, to be honest, as I had another business meeting. So if it's possible to share the presentation so I can go through it, really appreciate it.
Maddie, is that possible? Can we do that?
Yes, we have your LinkedIn, so I can probably share it via LinkedIn. This session is also posted on our YouTube if you want to see the full recording and not just the presentation. Perfect. Let me just grab the link to our YouTube channel.
There's also some links that I'm just chucking in the chat. It's just the sources that I used that kind of help me understand the whole MVNO landscape in 2026. Yeah, but I would highly recommend checking out our website as well for the 4-part story, because it goes way more in depth about each one.
Thanks for another insightful session. Yeah, not so much a question, but an observation about, I've been exposed to the MVNO space quite a bit. And in South Africa, I think one of the key drivers at the moment of the sort of popularity of MVNOs is the fact that the communication regulator enforced an obligation on the Vodacoms and MTNs, the MNOs, to host MVNOs. Previously, it was their option whether they wanted to or not, but with the new rules, they are obliged to do so. So it's much easier for a brand like Mr. Price, for example, or the banks that you mentioned, to now get access to become an MVNO because the networks are forced essentially by the regulator to do so. And one other observation is that what I've noticed is a lot of brands, especially perhaps like in the insurance or even micro-lending industry, are considering MVNO strategies because it gives them a way to return value to their subscribers, right? So because they often sell airtime and bundles or whatever at a reduced cost compared to the MNO pricing, in that way they can improve the affordability of their customers, and by doing so ensure that they are able to pay their insurance premium or their loan installment or whatever the case may be, so yeah, just interesting. And of course ecosystem can help prospective MVNOs and existing MVNOs to really divvy up those 4 stages and understand customers individually at every one of those stages, so yeah, I'm quite excited to see, because now, like you said as well, these brands are essentially, their only task is to drive adoption and uptake so that customers take their SIM card, and secondly, to retain them and make sure they use that SIM card. And I think behavioral science is absolutely the way to go. But yeah, like I said, just an observation today, no questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, especially like what you said about the kind of the obligation that MNOs now have to host MVNOs. I think it's going to create even more competition than we're already seeing. It's just interesting to see also that, being an MVNO is not so much about like how you handle your core network or your how you're doing the background stuff. It's more about how you're handling your customer facing services, and that kind of creates quite a special place for ecosystem as well, because that's where we sort of come in. We come in at the customer facing end, where you're bundling products in a way that's most appealing to individuals. And yeah, I think that has a huge role to play in places like retail MVNOs and bank MVNOs.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Thank you,
Okay,
Nicola.